Welcome back to Right Brain Psychotherapy on the Same Wavelength with Dr. Allan Schore. This is part 5. The questioner asks, how robust is the developmental process that leads to a healthy, self-regulating emotional system? Allan, the development of a healthy emotional system depends on growing up in a good enough emotional environment. Once the critical growth period for a particular brain area has passed, the structure of that area is more or less set, and subsequent development is built on top of that platform. Thus, early adverse environmental factors such as nutritional deficits or dysregulating attachment relationships can have a profound growth inhibiting effect upon the right brain and prohibit the development of a healthy, self-regulating emotional system. The effects can last a lifetime. Questioner: what happens to the developing brain in an adverse environment? Allan: there are two ways that the developing brain can be compromised by an inadequate early environment. Unused brain cells die naturally during the process of development, but early trauma can lead to excessive cell death. The building of new synapses is reduced, and existing synapses that could be useful are destroyed. The ability to create functional and integrated brain circuits is compromised. Questioner: does the timing of relational trauma affect what impact it has? Allan: yes. Emotional trauma will negatively impact the parts of the brain that are developing at the time of trauma. For example, if high levels of stress hormones are circulating in a pregnant mother, it upregulates the fetus. Sorry, that's a cat. It up. If high levels of stress hormones are circulating in a pregnant mother, it upregulates the fetus's developing stress response. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis, making the child and then the adult hypersensitive to stress. In contrast, relational trauma that occurs around the time of birth has a negative impact on how both the developing microarchitecture of the amygdala itself and how the amygdala connects to the HPA axis and other parts of the limbic system. Such damage has a profoundly harmful effect on the ability to form social bonds and on temperament. Suffering unrepaired and frequent emotional stress after about 10 months interferes with the experience-dependent maturation of the highest level regulatory systems in the right orbital front cortex. This opens the door to an impaired emotional regulation system, a limited facility for empathy, and problems in distinguishing present reality from irrelevant memories. In the long term, there is an increased risk of developing psychopathologies. Cell death and overpruning is equally damaging when it interferes with the connectivity between different brain regions. Relational trauma that occurs in the second year is likely to jeopardize not only the development of the right orbital frontal cortex itself, but also its connection to the right amygdala, whereupon it becomes much harder to modify the amygdala's crude response in accordance with reality. Overreaction becomes the norm, leading to severe problems with intimacy and affection, as well as problems with the control of fear and aggression. Questioner: what kind of parenting causes damage? Allan: there are obvious forms of abuse such as physical and sexual abuse, but emotional abuse can be equally damaging. Emotional abuse can result from inconsistent, erratic, and contradictory interactions, from overpowering and over-arousing interactions, or from neglect. If any of these circumstances, the infant will suffer long bouts of unregulated stress, negative effects, and, too frequently, no interactive repair. Neglect, which is proving to be the most severe threat to the development of the emotional brain, and benign neglect generationally leads to what is called avoidant attachment. The mother may be averse to physical contact and block her child's attempts to get close to her. She may be ambivalent about being a mother. She may be depressed. The neglect need not be overt, Profound psychological harm can occur when a mother who is emotionally unavailable, when her infant is distressed, even if she remains in physical contact with her child. Such an infant will learn to recoil from contact in an attempt to avoid the painful emotions roused in him by his rejecting mother. Over time, withdrawal becomes entrenched. For the rest of his life, when under stress, he will tend to convey an unconscious, non-verbal message that says, "Stay away, I don't need you, don't connect." Neurobiology, the lack of positive mirroring that characterizes neglect, means that not enough energy is generated for an infant's brain to grow all its interconnections. Moreover, because there is a limited positive arousal, the growth of these brain areas is especially compromised. Such infants develop a bias towards withdrawn state, mediated by the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. This is physiologically characterized with a low heart rate and a low heart rate variability. Temperamentally, these infants tend to grow up feeling helpless, and they have an increased risk of suffering from depression. They often have minimal emotional expression and a limited capacity to experience and to regulate intense emotional states, be they positive or negative. They are susceptible to be over-controlled, over-regulated, internalizing pathologies. Not only is a neglected child denied the interpersonal matrix upon which brain development depends, but also without access to interactive repair. Intense affect dysregulation endures as a long-lasting stress states. These are psychobiologically toxic. Early maternal neglect significantly increases the process of programmed cell death in the cortex compared to that in healthy development. Unpredictable and intrusive mothering often leads to what is called ambivalent anxious attachment. Infants can only cope with a certain intensity of emotional arousal before they move beyond their window of tolerance into a state of stressful emotional dysregulation. To avoid this, an infant will signal his need to temporarily disengage by looking away. However, if the caregiver suffered early relational trauma herself, she may feel abandoned by her infant's move to disengage, and in order to annul her own anxiety, she may double down her efforts to get her infant to re-engage with her. This exacerbates the infant's hyperarousal. Excitatory neurotransmitters and stress hormones flood the brain. Such children appear to have a difficult temperament. Their autonomic nervous system tends to be biased towards the sympathetic nervous system. They express emotions in an excessive way and suffer intense negative moods. They are overly dependent on their attachment figure, presumably to make her feel more secure, but also angry with her and rejecting of her. The most severe form of both abuse and neglect creates what is called a disorganized attachment. It occurs when an infant has no strategy that will help him cope with his caregiver, so he ends up profoundly confused. An infant typically seeks his parents when alarmed, so when a parent actually causes alarm, the infant is in an impossible situation. There is simultaneous and uncoupled hyperactivation of the sympathetic and parasympathetic circuits. This is subjectively experienced as a sudden transition into emotional chaos. If chronic, it represents a highly neurotoxic state that leads to death of neurons and the destruction of synaptic connections within both circuits.